Greetings. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and it is really a great pleasure to welcome you to our second in this year's series of Schusterman seminars. Assisting me today is our wonderful graduate student, Rima Farah, who will be monitoring the chat and monitoring questions from our Zoom audience. We also have an audience here in our seminar room, and I will be moderating their questions when our presentation concludes. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Figueroa. He is associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He researches music and politics, and in the first phase of his career, focused on the music of the Israel-Palestine crisis, culminating in his recently published book, City of Song: Music and the Making of Modern Jerusalem. His topic is indeed based on that work. It is entitled Musical Memorialism and the Politics of Bereavement in Jerusalem. Join me in welcoming Dr. Figueroa to the Schusterman Center. Michael.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome that Brandeis has given me during my stay here. Just going to take one moment to share my screen with you all.
Can you move the bar?
Yes.
I know that will block.
One moment. This was the issue before.
We went down or something. Yeah.
Okay. All ready?
Mm-hmm.
For the majority of my career, my main interest has been in how Middle Eastern societies look to music to narrate their histories, whether modern, medieval, ancient, or even mythical. My recent book, which Dr. Sarna so kindly plugged in his introduction, examines how Israeli musicians drew on the symbolic lexicons of the Hebrew Bible, medieval Piyutim, and early Zionist literature in order to shape public understandings of the modern conflict over Jerusalem. Music provides a powerful point of historiographical inquiry into the present, precisely because all performances of past repertory are fundamentally an exercise in historical memory. The multiple performances, parodies, recordings, and allusions to a particular song together form a genealogy that unfolds through time. In other words, the bounded concept of song, a song such as Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Me'al Piskat HaTzofim, Kotel, and so on, is flexible enough to accommodate a seemingly infinite number of variegated listening experiences as long as they figure into broader social discourse. This is a process in which multiple hearings of a recording or separate recordings of the same song, even on different media, serve as instantiations of a singular conception of a work. A song's work identity is why a listener can recognize the song Bab El Wad, whether it is performed by Yafa Yalkoni or Shlomo Gronich, or subject to parody or interpolation by other contemporary musicians. Critical to my research has been the realization that musicians, poets, choreographers, and other artists understand well the political expediency of narrative expression in Israeli society, and have deployed it during and after times of war for commemoration, critique, or other political ends. In turn, their publics project their political desires onto songs by performing them in ritual contexts that commemorate those violent historical moments, or else call into question the very moral legitimacy of this memorialism. Musicians have been critical to establishing territorial sovereignty as a matter of public debate, as they use their social and symbolic capital to represent places in ways that resonated within multiple political domains, most especially for the public bereavement of those who died in service to the nation in those places, and to provide meta-commentary on bereavement practices themselves. Today, I'll discuss some examples of the memorialization of wartime violence in Israeli musical practice. It is about what comes after war, what solidifies and transfers the memory to be instantiated time and again across multiple hearings and performances. Within dominant forms of Israeli national culture, music has been a preeminent form of expression for constructing or contesting such localized emotional styles, social structures, and cultural routines. This is perhaps nowhere more evident than for purposes of commemoration and bereavement. And scholars of Israeli commemoration forms have long understood that commemoration and bereavement have a dynamic history according to changing tastes, relationships to national culture, religious affiliation, and especially this nature of the memory being commemorated. As such, it would be impossible to characterize in broad strokes some underlying structural commonality that unifies all such practices in music. Instead, I show how the politics of bereavement are complex and given to transfiguration according to musicians' political or aesthetic agendas. Their genealogies link the everyday with the extraordinary, and intense sorrow with biting critique, or even irreverence. About halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, a parade of eviscerated military vehicles has sat decomposing on the side of Highway 1 since the 1948 war. This monument commemorates a site of violence during the early months of the war, the Battle for Jerusalem. Some of the fiercest fighting for the city occurred there, approximately 15 miles west of Jerusalem's western entrance, where Jewish forces attempted to break the Arab blockade in order to establish passage to alleviate the city's critical shortage of food, water, and supplies. At the time, the road running through this area, which passed through a narrow valley whose Arabic name is Bab el-Wad, was the only known point of entry into Jerusalem from the Western territory controlled by Jewish fighting groups. This gave the area its strategic military value for both Israel and Jordan. Conquering Jerusalem necessitated control over the passageway, and so it determined the stakes of the casualty-heavy Latrun and Bab el-Wad battles. After 3 failed campaigns, the Haganah successfully built a bypass road to the north, called Burma Road, which served as a supply line for the besieged city. The iron skeletons that continue to sit roadside there serve as a monument to remind passers-by of the fighters' sacrifice amid overwhelming odds. Since the 1948 war, this place has become broadly emblematic of the siege of Jerusalem and represents a modern story of Jewish determination and survival under the direst circumstances. It is also the contextual backdrop for the 1949 poem Bab el-Wad by Chaim Goli. In addition to being a poet, Chaim Goli was a soldier who fought in the Palmach, an elite striking force during the 1948 war. After the war, he became the leading voice of his generation of poets, most especially with the release of his 1949 volume, Pirchei Esh, or Flowers of Fire, which helped to define the poetics of the so-called statehood generation, Doa Medina. The text for Bab el-Wad operates on multiple referential levels to recall soldiers' memories and memories of soldiers. The poem draws on the spatial ethos of Yeshuv-era cultural production, such as in the Shirei Chalutzim and Shirei Eretz Israel, the pioneer songs and the songs of the land of Israel, sometimes called folk song. It's filled with naturalistic imagery drawn from stone, star, sun, and sea, mixed with references that index the violent memories of soldiers who fought in the war: iron, lead, fire, knives, and armor. Interestingly, Goli never mentions the name of Jerusalem, preferring the euphemism Ha'il, the city. But as musicologist Eliyahu Cohen writes, quote, every child in the country knew what he meant, end quote. The word that I've translated as here, so po and later kan, opens the majority of the poem's lines, locating the narrator and listeners at Bab al-Wad, the location. Through a casual simile in the refrain's closing line, the very vehicle carcasses that sit on the highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv today appear in this 1949 song as a metonym for anonymous fallen soldiers, making their absence present. I'm quoting here Handelman and Shamgar Handelman, making their absence present so that it serves the agency of the living, end of quote. The dead and the living are, in the words of the song, one family here. By the penultimate verse, the song's narrative undergoes a shift in perspective from the first person singular to the first person plural, underscoring a connection between individual and collective experience. The narrator sings on behalf of the nation, frames the event in terms of a shared social memory of violent trauma and collective grief, and implores listeners to remember the dead. But just whom should be remembered is rendered ambiguous, as Chaim Recknitzer points out in an article he wrote on this song. So in the lyrics, the dead are characterized as both unknown and as people the narrator remembers one by one, suggesting that they were his known comrades. Recknitzer argues that the term for unknown, almoni, functions similarly to the English use of one, one knew this or one should do this, right? Pointing to a general third person who can be assigned any real name by the readers. Its use here, as he writes, quote, allows the readers to fill in the names of the soldiers they have personally known to have died in the wars, creating a personalized memory while retaining a shared experience, end quote. This slippage creates an opportunity for ritualized remembrance, as people who read the poem or who participate in singing the song version of Bab al-Wad on national holidays connect personal memories of fallen soldiers with the collective commemoration of national death more generally, thus reinforcing the sense of personal investment in the national project. The line, "A spring day will come, the cyclamens will bloom," was especially prescient. Every spring during Memorial Day and Independence Day, people lay wreaths at the memorial site in ritual observance of the two holidays that together capture the fact that both, quote, sorrow and glory live together. The text is not merely mimetic, but also narrative. It tells a familiar story with vivid sensory detail and in the present tense. The narrator's very memories are triggered by the landscape. The reader remembers along with the narrator. This was precisely the motive behind the poem's musical arrangement. Shaike Yelkoni, a central figure in the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary unit that became the core of the IDF after the 1948, had the idea to set Gori's poems, Bab al-Wad and Havayut, to music. The project to realize Bab al-Wad in song included an arrangement by Shmuel Fershko, a Polish composer pianist who had already made a name for himself in the 1940s cabaret scene of Tel Aviv, and a now iconic vocal performance by Yafa Yarkoni, a then peripheral figure in the national music scene and the spouse of Shaike Yarkoni. We'll see her in a little bit. The musical setting involves one major formal change to the poem. The original strophes have been reorganized into a verse-chorus-verse form, and the second stanza serves as the refrain. For those of you who are looking closely, it begins at the pickup to measure 11. This highlights the song's memorial function, with the site's name and its monumentality reiterated throughout the song. The stylistic complexity of the song, with its gestures to the Tel Aviv cabaret scene and its cosmopolitan influences, through modal mixture and other compositional gestures that I speak on in other settings, inflects the text with heightened poetic sensibility and its functional memorialism. Listening to Yafa Yarkoni's performance of Bab al-Wad, one can almost smell the crisp, dark, pine-perfumed air of calm that punctuated the sweaty daytime fighting. The singing narrator, with pronounced vocal pathos, communes with the national dead by way of the landscape. In the final verse, which begins, "A spring day will come," she shifts from song to speech and intones the text in the manner of a political speech or religious incantation before rejoining the chorus of voices in the pickup. This creates a sense of teleology in the song form, although that sense is punctuated by the use of a repeating refrain. The arrangement is rhythmically based around a fairly consistent dotted 8th note, 16th note pattern, like that. But Iaccone's vocal delivery often blurs this static conception of time. Her intense vocal rubato, which mingles with vibrating swells in the violin, creates a sonic metaphor for the oblique haziness of memory and experience against the objective measure of linear time. Let's give this a listen.
כביש אספלט שחור, סלעים ורחצים, ערב ואת יורד, רוח ים נושבת, אור כוכב ראשון, מעבר בית מחסים, בלבד לנצח זכור נא את שמותינו, שיירות פרצו בדרך אל העיר, בצידי הדרך הם טלים מתינו, שלד הברזל שותק כמו
I'd love to let on, but I think you're here to hear me talk, I guess, instead of hearing her sing. It's a bad deal, in my opinion. So Iaccone's rendition of Bab el-Wad enjoys pride of place within the Israeli song canon. It was one of five of her songs included on the anthology for the Jubilee of State of Israel, Gadalnu Yachad. And the song continues to, I've learned through my ethnographic fieldwork, continues to be programmed in live cover performances in the 20th century, or 21st century, into its third decade. But both the song and its source poem have been criticized for the text's anonymous treatment of both Israeli soldiers and Arab enemies. As philosopher Meir Buzuglo remarks, quote, "The non-appearance or disappearance of the Arabs from Goi's poem erases any guilt and carries within it dehumanization of the Arab," end of quote. The song thus has been taken to task through musical parodies. In the years following the song's original release, Buzuglo's father, Rabbi David Buzuglo, a singer of, oh, I forgot to show you that quote, my bad. So Rabbi David Buzuglo, a singer of Hebrew liturgical poems, Piyutim, wrote a poignant contrafact of Fershko's Bab el-Wad melody called Binu na Mordim, Wise Up, O Rebels. And the song addresses the original song's apparent political and religious deficiencies. The lyrics of the refrain are printed on the slide. In both, is that the refrain? It's an excerpt. In both Bab el-Wad and Wise Up, O Rebels, the singer-narrator commands the listener to remember, using slight variations on the imperative form of the word lizkor, to remember. But the terms are fundamentally different in context. While Wise Up, O Rebels is specifically geared toward remembrance as a theological tenet of Judaism, Bab el-Wad is a religious poem without references to God, to past tradition, or to classical Jewish texts, as Recknisser points out in that article I mentioned before. The song associated with Goi, Fershko, and Iacchone represents a secular labor Zionist vision of Jewish modernity, whereas Buzaglo's song privileges enduring theological and ritual aspects of Judaism as the rightful pillars of a Jewish society, as his lyrics, laden with biblical references, suggest. Let's give this performance a rendition by Rabbi Chaim Luke. A listen now.
בינונה מורדים רודפי קרב ורצח לא לתת בכל עולם שופך שיחו מול שוכן שמיו כל יכול לנצח כי בצל סוכות שם שם לו מבטחו זיכרונה יום בן חלוף אוכל יצירה כת שלום נתנה בכל מר לבריון על ההוא יציר נפשו זיכרונה איפה קירו לכם שלום.
Yeah, so that was the refrain. I just doubted myself momentarily while I was speaking. And by the way, the reason why I have to have this contemporary recording is because David Buzaglo refused to have his voice recorded. He had suspicions about the technology. So we only have the only reason there are performers who can do renditions of it is because it is a contrafact on Bab el-Wad whose melody is known. So that we know how the song goes, in other words, because we have the text and it scans with the melody, but otherwise it was never recorded or written down by the original composer. So during a filmed conversation for Jerusalem-based cultural organization Beit Abichai in September of 2014, Chaim Gori and Meir Buzaglo, the son of Rabbi David Buzaglo, discussed how the intersecting genealogies of Bab el-Wad and Binuna Mordim, present a musical synthesis of seemingly opposing views of Israeli national culture. The latter, so Binuna Mordim, is a thoroughly critical text that censures the glorification of war and death in labor Zionism, and yet Goli quite graciously viewed the dialectic it formed with his poem as what he calls, quote, a call for mutual curiosity. He and Meir Buzaglo understood the frictions between the two songs as being an embodiment of domestic Israeli social problems that are rooted in nationalism and religiosity. And to be sure, they saw this musical encounter as an opportunity to view those as compatible forces within an Israeli society by virtue of their rootedness in the eternal cultural mission, their words, mythologized and enshrined by Zionism. Let's watch the first minute or so of this.
שלום, שלום עליכם, איזה כיף. גם פעם שנייה. יופי, יופי, שבע קטן.
בינונה מורדים רודפי קרב ורצח.
גדלתי ושרתי את באב אל-ואד עוד לפני שידעתי בכלל על השירה של אבא שלי. והנה לפני כמה שנים טובות נתקלתי בשיר שכתב אבא, בינונה מורדים, שהוא כתב למילים של באב אל-ואד. ופתאום עלתה חידה, למה לכתוב מילים עבריות על שיר עברי שורשי?
אני בינתיים קראתי את השיר של אבא עליו השלום. וחשבתי שעה ארוכה באמת מה בפגישה הזאת דרך המנגינה יש מהמאפיין חוויה רוחנית ישראלית? השיר הופך להיות גשר לטקסט שהוא שונה לחלוטין. אז הניגוד הזה שהוא צריך ליצור מרחק, יוצר פתאום פגישה. באבל וואד, לנצח.
Okay, unfortunately, it's a fascinating video if you find it on YouTube, where Beit Avichai has a very active account. So the founding mythology that I was just describing has also been a source of play for musicians who do find its effects either within Israeli society or outwardly projected as dominance over the Palestinian population to be unsavory or immoral. The band Habiluim, for example, created a grotesque parody of Bab al-Wad for the opening track to their 2007 album, Shikul Vekishalon, Bereavement and Failure. And much of this album is devoted to sending up the hegemony of memorialism within Israeli culture. The Bab al-Wad track sticks out, however, because it is the most egregiously irreverent take on quasi-sacred national symbols, using what musicologist Oded Erez, riffing on the philosophy of Michel de Certeau, calls, quote, the practice of everyday quotation, quote. The song's title, Bab al-Wad 38 Aleph, is rendered like a street address, indicating that through use, repetition, and difference, like the names of real streets, the subject memorialized in the original song, as he says, quote, slowly loses its original semantic value, becoming more than a place, end of quote. In the lyrics, which depict a bizarre airline flight, the two band members, Noam Inbar and Yami Wiesler, lampoon the dread that Israelis carry with them, with dark jokes about sudden infant death syndrome and the Holocaust film Schindler's List, among other taboo subjects. The song's bridge and chorus comment most directly on the original Bab al-Wad. Here, the singer assumes the position of the flight attendant who seeks to keep the passengers docile by offering them a pair of headphones playing songs of old. In this case, represented by Yafa Yarkoni's Bab al-Wad, which appears in the Habiluim song via a distorted sample, warbling and slowed down to match the dragging sardonic tempo of its new musical setting. The presence of Yarkoni's voice as a sound recording artifact is conspicuous. The unnatural pitch, timbre, and envelope of this otherwise familiar sound produces a schizophrenia that serves the political ends of the song itself. As Erez poignantly summarizes, the symbol of Bab al-Wad dominates the cultural space at its feet, within which it repeatedly appears like a sculpture carved in stone or like the iron skeleton laid in the roadside, a monument, end of quote. So why don't we hear a bit of the song? I actually pulled up their music video. Get us past, you can see that they bring in, it's all about the function of music, right? They have to bring in this phonograph and then play the song and stand there all bored, right? So let me just fast forward a little bit so you can hear it.
ויש גם אוזניות עם שירים של פעם שתמיד עושים נעים. באב אל-וואד, באב אל-וואד, לא יתחילו בלעדינו באב אל-וואד.
באב אל-וואד, באב אל-וואד.
אני לא כאן.
All right. As the kids say, it actually kind of slaps, but anyway, we can save that conversation for later. So implied in the song's lyrics and musical signification is the idea that these passengers are so anxious about impending tragedy, in no small part due to the musical memorialism that they have internalized as an everyday reality, and yet which also becomes their self. Bab al-Wad stands in for Habiluim as the memorial song par excellence, a reputation that it has earned through consistent programming and rejuvenation in the 58 years between its initial release and the Habiluim parody. The stakes of internal Israeli parodies of militarization will come further into focus in my discussion of Ammunition Hill in just a moment. Ultimately, Bab al-Wad is a core component of the memorial repertory that is sung perennially, both at official state and municipal ceremonies where large crowds gather in auditoriums or public spaces or tune in on radio, television, or online, at run-of-the-mill concerts that are not themselves framed, or at run-of-the-mill concerts that are not themselves framed as commemorative events. In other words, it's just ubiquitous to commemorate, right? One can scarcely make it through Memorial Day, for example, without hearing the song Bab al-Wad played or performed multiple times across multiple venues, as I've done. It's also one of what sociologist Danny Kaplan calls the siren songs that are played to, quote, engineer national sentiments in the aftermath of military and paramilitary terrorist violence in Israel. End of quote. So Kaplan writes that this repertory forms a linkage between the representation of commemoration and the representation of emergency, and here I'm quoting again, that is persistent in Israeli music programming. This linkage is a part of the everyday in Jerusalem as a crucial site of conflict in the country and in the region. Like the many cemeteries and monuments located throughout the city, musical memorialism too forms an important part of Jerusalem's commemorative landscape. Givat HaTachmoshet, or Ammunition Hill, is an Israeli memorial, a museum, an archive, a destination for Israeli school field trips and for tourists, and a venue for induction into the Israel Defense Forces. Originally the site of a British Mandate-era police station, it was a setting for a particularly intense battle during the Six-Day War that was critical to Israel's success in securing Jerusalem and opening a contiguous Jewish territory between West Jerusalem and Mount Scopus, where the Hebrew University had been built, but sat relatively dormant when the city was divided as a result of the 1948 war. The battle at Ammunition Hill has come to be remembered for its fierceness and for the unbearably close proximity between Israeli and Jordanian soldiers trading shots and watching each other die. The tides turned when Israeli paratroopers blew up the Jordanians' massive concrete bunker and overtook their position. The official casualty count holds that 36 Israelis and 71 Jordanians were killed in the battle. Memories of this violence elicit strong emotional responses from people who lived through the war, as well as those who relive it through musical commemoration of the battle. And this battle was memorialized in a popular 1968 song, Ammunition Hill, recorded by the Central Command Variety Ensemble. Written by lyricist Yoram Tahalev and melodist Yair Rosenblum, the song is structured around prose narratives of the battle, taken from quotations of military figures that are punctuated by the singing of a monophonic chorus, which advances the dramatic plot. An excerpt of the lyrics appear in English on the slide, and please excuse the lack of Hebrew, but there's just a lot of text here and too little space. That's not even the whole song. So my editor was not wild about how much text there was for this song, but here we are. In many ways, the song has become emblematic of the bravery and might of the Israeli army. Notably, the phrase Amud HaShachar, Pillar of Dawn, was intended as a reference to the Israelites' journey out of Egypt in the book of Exodus, wherein, quote, the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light that they might travel day and night. End quote. Throughout the narrative of the song, delivered in plain language, the soldier narrator faces overwhelming odds, yet persists and ultimately prevails. Just as important, his combat brothers are not so lucky. And by the end of the second stanza, it is clear that the story is really about memorializing the dead. Ammunition Hill is a song whose musical elements illustrate a form of military mimesis employed by songwriters in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. A march-like rhythm on the snare drum and the accordion's quickly alternating bass chord figure maintain a quick tempo throughout. The lyrics form is instructive here too. The majority of vocal production is oriented toward the spoken delivery of prose, as if the speaker is debriefing the audience on the battle's events in a dispassionate manner. The tension breaks only for the melodic entrance of the unison chorus. Let's hear some of that.
היה אז בוקר היום השני למלחמה בירושלים. האופק החביר במזרח. היינו בעיצומו של הקרב על גבעת התחמושת. לחמנו שם מזה 3 שעות. התנהל קרב עקשני, קטלני. הירדנים נלחמו בעקשנות. זה היה יעד מבוצר בצורה בלתי רגילה. בשלב מסוים של הלחימה נשארו לידי 4 חיילים בלבד. עלינו לשם בכוח של 2 פלוגות. לא ידעתי היכן האחרים כיוון שהקשר עם דודיק המ"פ ניתק עוד בתחילת הקרב. באותו רגע חשבתי שכולם נהרגו. 2:30 נכנסנו דרך הטרשים בשדה האש והמוקשים של גבעת התחמושת מול בונקרים מבוצרים.
And it continues in this way throughout. I could have short clips, but again, I have more to say. So other Israeli artists have sought to turn these symbols of nationalism and militarism inward via parody or other forms of deconstruction in order to draw attention to the uneasy relation between expressions of dominance and the desire to live a normal life not shaped by a state of emergency. The dual roles of these parodies form part of a long tradition of Jewish humor emanating from moments of crisis in an attempt to rally Israelis around an intimate memory of bodily sacrifice. Often deploying taboo humor, as we saw with Habiluim, they can serve the purpose of domesticating national myths, solidifying social bonds, while serving as a form of surrogate agency in a situation where little agency exists, or for struggling over competing notions of locality, among other functions, right? So more often than not, such deconstructive treatments serve the purpose of a more serious critique of top-down notions of sociality that emanate from the militarization of national symbols. According to choreographer Roli Asaf, that was supposed to already be up. There we go. Ammunition Hill, Giv'at HaTachmoshet, the song you just heard, entered Israelis' quote DNA by way of, but partially dissociated from, its commemorative function. Asaf's best known and most toured work, The Hill, features a 5-minute long edited recording of its namesake song. Asaf's core aesthetic in this piece is his playing with the tension created between sounds and movement, not necessarily a politicized engagement with past war, but we'll get there, okay? The piece nevertheless illuminates much about the place of violence in Israeli social memory through a form of musical eclecticism that renders even the most harrowing memories of violence banal until reenacted. Before we go further, I'm going to give you a taste of the show's aesthetics in a promotional video. By the way, the musical choice here is in some ways jarring, actually. It's Handel's Circe, which is, I don't remember being part of the show, but it's what the Israel festival put together for them. Actually, fast forward this as well. Oh, that's incorrect. I actually want to start from the beginning. I forgot that I actually did the work of cutting this video down for you instead of just going ahead. slip that right out. So unfortunately, there is not a filmed full version of this performance that I can find. And I know that when I attended, I'm going to talk about my experience. Chloe was not keen on any kind of photography or anything at the time. It was a preview show. So I'm going to see if the power of prose can put you in my seat, if you will. So I might cue you to maybe just like close your eyes and imagine, but it's totally optional, especially for the folks at home whom I can't see. So I attended a concert featuring The Hill in October of 2017. The performance blasted open with a recording of the Israel Defense Forces March Tzahal Soed, a rather generic military march written in 1963 by Yoav Talmi in an international style, with requisite melodic sequences, alternations of featured instrumental groups, and tidy cadences, all in a moderate tempo to facilitate procession in parades and ceremonies. More of that military mimesis, right? Its playing in The Hill has garnered criticism from right-leaning Israelis, as it includes a moment when two of the three dancers grab their buttocks with both hands and wiggle their waists in time to the march. This creates some distancing from the song, whose routinized ritual playing is typically performed with controlled body movements aligned with the music's militaristic ethos. The dancers seemed to parody the song's staidness with their booty shaking. This was, in fact, an act of lampoonery, but Asaf told me that he meant to poke fun not at Israeli nationalism per se, but rather at the self-seriousness of Israeli national identity and its semi-sacred emblems, such as the song Ammunition Hill and also Tzahal Soed. This accords with my analysis of Habi Levim's parody of Bab el-Wad, where the song's status as a musical memorial itself evacuates the object of some of its original meaning and allows for new meanings to accumulate or be created anew in future iterations. As Asaf told me during our interview, quote, "I'm attracted to symbols and stereotypes, codes that everybody knows how to read, and playing with them. It's beyond culture, it's DNA," end of quote. He based the booty shaking movements on a real memory from his time as a paratrooper in the IDF, when during a formal military ceremony, two of his friends began surreptitiously boogieing ironically to the march song. During our conversations, he characterized this moment of the show, perhaps with right-wing criticism in his mind, as a kind of laughing with, rather than laughing at, the Israeli military's place of pride in national culture. So well-intentioned familiarity rather than mockery, right? For Asaf, the social component of social memory is based on relationships rather than on any abstract notion of collectivity. In the context of The Hill, this move foregrounds a youthful irreverence, which humanizes the dancer soldiers before they are sent to die in the battle for Ammunition Hill. As a choreographer, Asaf seems particularly reliant on arm styling for communicating thematic material. Much of the opening song is danced by a duet whose hands remain locked together while the dancers twirl and contort into various poses of embrace and near separation. The soldiers remain connected in spite of it all, highlighting the confraternal bonds facilitated by military life. Meanwhile, the third dancer has been standing still at the rear, house left corner, and eventually begins to fall forward as the erstwhile duet rushes to catch him before hitting the floor. Asaf develops this idea further during the climactic song Ammunition Hill, whose accordion-laden bars play in an extended loop, gradually increasing in volume before breaking into the iconic prose lyrics. The choreography here focuses more directly on depictions of battle violence, as each dancer appears to play multiple characters from both armies. The scenes are quite cinematic, as the dancers seamlessly transform between pockets of fighting, each with different physical scenarios, from hand-to-hand to gun-oriented combat. As a soldier, and the video kind of showed some of this, right? As the soldier characters fall dead or wounded, they're caught by brothers in arms, and in some cases dragged to safety, as in a real-life battle scene. These moments are punctuated at one point by a fleeting moment of celebratory line dance drawn from the modern Israeli folk dance tradition, hora. The final song is somewhat jarring due to its complicated relation to the war context. The Bee Gees' I Started a Joke. Having been released on the Australian band's 1968 album Idea, 1 year after the Six-Day War, the song is only slightly anachronistic as period music, but its clever deployment of sentimental pop stylistic signifiers, combined with an alienated lyrical voice, seem to signal Asaf's ambivalence toward the thematic material of The Hill. The brief lyrics end on a sour note, "Till I finally died, which started the whole world living. Oh, if I'd only seen that the joke was on me." The song's melody and lyrics, along with the choreographed succession of dead bodies hitting the ground, highlight the injustice of individual martyrdom for a cause with complicated moral implications. This idea moves to the foreground in the piece's final moments, when the music subsides and gives way to a synthesized sonic palette of buzzing, bell-like tones moving through filtered swells and washes of whooshing white noise that seem to indicate the passing of artillery shells. A shell-shocked lone soldier stands in frozen horror while the large battle scene unfolds around him. At the end, a cornet, perhaps the ultimate sonic signifier of military death, enters prominently, then trails off before the lights abruptly cut to black. That's super annoying. Well, you all find out with me if I have malware, because I can't get rid of that. Let me try it. There we go. Okay, I'll bring us back 1 second. Okay, great. Now, during our conversations, Asaf told me emphatically that he did not originally set out to create a piece about war. The idea to use Ammunition Hill, the very song and memorialized battle site for which the piece was originally named, occurred to him very late in the creative process. Asaf began with choreographic sketches and then searched for music to focus the steps into an overarching narrative. His other options were quite different, stylistically speaking. Among the other pieces he considered were an excerpt from Bach's Goldberg Variations, and also the Austro-German classical ethos originally ran deep, as Sahal Soed was actually a replacement for Asaf's original selection of Franz Schubert's Du bist der Ruch, as recorded by Argentine mezzo-soprano Bernarda Fink. So what's striking about the soundtrack selection process is that the various pieces Asaf considered for inclusion seem to bear virtually no structural musical resemblance to one another. But Asaf told me that as a dancer, he perceived a beat, a fragment of rhythm, isolated from all other musical parameters, that transcended the stylistic diversity of the musical repertory that he repeatedly referred to in our interview as his library, defined cheekily as, quote, the availability of stuff in my mind, end of quote. Throughout his interview statements to me and during post-concert talkbacks, Asaf seemed to invite the psychoanalytic retrospection of others rather than claim agency for programmatic politics in his creative expression. He told me, for example, quote, sometimes I feel disappointed in myself for not being an activist. I have devoted myself to making connections between movement and music. Maybe subconsciously, I want to stimulate something. And in fact, he said, so although he would not disclose what that something might be when I pushed him on this. So finally, I asked him, what is this piece really about? After a moment of pondering, he answered, Achuvat halochamim, literally meaning something like warrior's love or brotherhood, but more idiomatically referring to an internalized responsibility for one's fellow soldier. It is meant to be the webbing that holds together the military's individuals into a cohesive unit. Now, so in other words, Asaf was referring to a more specific emotional quality in his work than something, let's say, like Leut, which is Chaim Guri's sort of like, material. Here, Achovat Halochamim has specific associations with active soldiers and is thus compartmentalized within a military setting. He commemorates life during the time of service rather than its ending in death. In light of this understanding, one might interpret Asaf's use of the phrase to indicate that his depictions of wartime violence in The Hill are meant to emphasize the pastness of military life rather than to generate a model of citizenship based on combat unit relations, as in Leut. This shared experience, both real among members of the same company or brigade and imagined among Israelis in general, is part of the social DNA, to use Asaf's words, of Israeli society. Those experiences are triggered, relived, negotiated, and renewed through the varied performances of memorial songs such as Ammunition Hill and Bab al-Wad, whose programming in a diversity of performance environments, from recording studios, concert halls, and poetry festivals, to Jerusalem's public spaces and the monuments themselves, and at regular intervals on holidays continually reinstate the emergencies that threaten Jewish survival and control over the homeland territory. To use another of Roy Asaf's metaphors, the library, the reverence of, so his metaphor of the library, the reverence of national death is a large volume in the library of national affect. Like actual books, people interpret and use such texts, and as I've shown, their musical realizations in many different ways. The memorial repertory thus becomes a site of contesting identity, politics, history, and the morality of war itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And let me again encourage you to take a look at Dr. Figueroa's City of Song, Music, and the Making of Modern Jerusalem. I'm going to start by asking whether anybody here in the room has any questions, and then we'll move on to the Zoom audience. Professor Silva, yeah.
First of all, thank you. You convinced me that I'm more interested in these songs than I thought I was. I'm just interested if you could give us sort of the Cliff's Notes version of Jerusalem and all this, how the songs are different. You seem very interested in the kind of irreverent takes, which leads, I think people know, Jerusalem of Lead that comes after Seven Arieli. Is that because Jerusalem is such a heavy kind of subject, contrasting pioneer songs or post-48 songs from other areas? Why is Jerusalem so?
Yeah, that's a great question, because clearly there are other war sites and they're commemorated musically. I chose, so these fit into my larger project of looking at the way that Jerusalem is rendered in song, is represented in song in different ways. And I, in the parts of my book that I'm sort of drawing some of these examples from, I'm treating these memorial songs around places in Jerusalem as a kind of a thematic repertory. They do fit into the broader practice of musical commemoration in Israel. You could hear Yibat Tachmoshet in Tel Aviv. I haven't heard that, but I imagine you can. But I've heard Bab al-Wad in Metula, for example, right? So, these could be framed very differently in combination with other memorial songs, and in fact, other memorial songs about other places are also sung in Jerusalem. As I've seen in Yom HaZikaron concerts in Kikar Safra. You might have songs by Natan Altman and various people who are singing about other places, right? So, but this tension that you pull out between Jerusalem and the nation is one that I explore in other contexts besides the memorialism conversation. I'd say here, why these songs, why Jerusalem, is because they're part of a project on Jerusalem, but they could be, that's sort of a cop-out answer, but in the sense, I studied them alongside other songs and chose them because of what they reveal about, in the context of the book project, at least, they reveal what they reveal about other sides of Jerusalem besides the Yerushalayim Shel Zahavs and songs like that. Yeah.
Oh, we'll have to read your book.
I had, I'll say a short comment and then a question. One is that there's something with hills that's really interesting and that has a parallel with Israeli cinema. Hill 24 doesn't answer, Hill Phone doesn't answer, right? The parody of it, we'll talk about later. That's really interesting and I think worth exploring. And the second, which is this is the question, this really interesting linkage between the sort of protest tradition and the Mizrahi musical tradition, right? It's not just the people, right? Buzaglu and Chaim Luke are hugely important names for Mizrahi music in Israel, but it comes up in the music itself, right? I think he's playing an oud, right? And maybe it's a different kind of string instrument.
Kanun.
A kanun, okay.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered if you could comment a bit about that and how these sort of ethnic tensions attach themselves to these memorial tensions between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi.
That's a great question. Yeah, because actually these songs, as far as I know, have not really been part of Mizrahi political consciousness in a pronounced way as much as other repertories, right? So can I ask you, if I paraphrase you, are you asking me if there is a kind of a like inter-ethnic hostility edge to?
Yes.
Okay.
Or is it just in that one example you brought, it's just so distinctly because it's Buzaglu and Look that it, you know.
Yeah. No, right. I mean, I think Chaim Luke plays it because it's part of this like heritage of modern Moroccan Jewish music, right? I mean, he sings Piyutim as well. But my understanding of David Buzaglu, and I should have asked Meir when we were corresponding about the song and permissions and translations and stuff like that. But my understanding is that his opposition to this stream of Zionism isn't rooted in his what I don't know if he'd call it his Maghrebiness, his Arabness, something like that, right? More as much as his religiosity. So that said, his intentions are one thing and how it's interpreted is another. I wonder if, for example, Chaim Luke's audiences hear this opposition to the Ashkenazi-dominated, labor Zionist ethos of Israeli nationalism as coming with a sort of ethnic tinge. That would be a great topic for ethnographic study, which I haven't done in this particular song. I never heard the song performed in person, but now I want to. It's a good excuse to buy a plane ticket.
Yeah, Chaim Luke concert is worth it.
Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone in the room? All right, let me hand it over to Rima Farah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. And we want to remind our remote audience to put your questions in the chat, okay? And we look forward to pass your questions to our speaker. And my question to you for now is, you look at this through a modern lens about the modernity of the land of Jerusalem and about modern nationalism, the pride and the unity of the national pride. But I think also, it makes us think about what was the role of women in this whole production of identity, culture, nationality. Were there any women involved, or any writings, or any poetry, or an image of a woman in that context?
So absolutely. In the larger study that I pulled some of this material from, women musicians are the most prominent figures in the narrative, and that's just the way. I mean, this is one of the things that this is like a soft thesis that I'm thinking about exploring, which is that one of the things that makes Israel Middle Eastern is that women singers become tasked with representing the nation on an international stage, the way that in Egypt and Lebanon, for example, and I would say Palestine as well, with Fayrouz. She gets both Lebanon and Palestinian nationalism. But so in this case, Yafa Yelkoni was I think the only woman appeared on a slide. I felt pretty weird about that when I woke up this morning. But it's interesting that one of the reasons I think is because because of the concepts that I invoked, like Leut and Achvat al-Lochamim, those are masculinized concepts. So, and because the military is so foundational to this particular brand of national identity, that it's a lot of dude bros, if you will. But that said, Yafa Yelkoni, the original singer of Bab al-Wad, Her nickname was the War
The
Singer.
war singer. And she didn't like it so much.
She hated it.
Yeah.
I have a whole section I cut for time on that. I interviewed one of her daughters about this. It was a thing that gave her a career, but also her politics didn't align with this even. She was fairly, I don't know how she described herself in many different ways, but she's, I would argue center left, as many of this generation ended up becoming later in life. And this gave her gigs, but the such a strong association with militarism really didn't sit right with her. Same thing is true to a lesser extent with Naomi Shemer, the songwriter for the song invoked here around the table, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav.
She's not center left.
Not at all. Yes, but I don't think she was comfortable with the militarism. From what I read in her papers, because the song wasn't originally in her mind meant to be. I didn't give everyone access to that song in this talk, but that song is the most famous Israeli song besides the national anthem. Jerusalem of Gold, and she did not intend the song to be politicized, but the context in which it appeared, which was 6 weeks before the impending war, was highly politicized, and she actually added verses to the end that confirmed its association with the conquest of Jerusalem. So that's a story that many have told. I have a whole chapter on it, including the parodies and versions and stuff. But my point is that actually these, in the singer of that, the main singer, Shuli Natan, she and Yafa Alkoni, and to a lesser extent in terms of the military conversation, Shoshana Damari were sort of like some of the main, and Ofra Chaza, I keep going, so actually many of these are Yemeni singers, are tasked with doing some of the work of articulating national identity at pivotal moments in Israeli cultural and military history.
So we have a question here. Would you please explain a bit more about how the music modified the emotional styles?
Modified emotional styles.
Yeah, modified the emotional styles. There's no additional explanation here of what it meant, but perhaps you can take it to your own.
Yeah, I suppose they mean something about, what is actually the power of this stuff, this music, right? Like what's different from reading a text, for example. That's sort of a foundational question in my discipline in some ways. It's one that not many of us answer explicitly, but I'll say that one can assess this through archival testimony, but also through ethnographic fieldwork. I go to these concerts. Well, I did before COVID. I'd fly in and go to these holiday concerts, look at what people are doing, talk to them about their experience, and have them describe the function of especially collective singing. Shira Betzibur, which is a play on Tefillah Betzibur, public prayer, public singing. It is a critical facet of Israeli national culture and of nation making. And these memorial songs are a huge part of the repertory of collective singing. Not every song is about death and war and victory and stuff. Some songs are about love or have nothing to do with anything around the setting. But the point is, singing together in public in unison is known across many, many, many cultures as one of the sort of foundational catalysts for either the creation of or maintenance of social bonds. So I actually say that to answer the question, the main thing is actually not putting these white earbuds on. It's singing together in public at certain auspicious and banal moments.
Right. Okay. Yes, our audience will look forward to your questions. We, for now, we don't have more questions from the audience, but I have probably another question for you.
Okay.
Yes. Actually, Shayna touched on that topic of the Ashkenazi and Mizrahi thing, and because when you talk about all these expressions of nationalism in general, about national pride and national unity, and it actually emerged among the Ashkenazi more because the whole idea about the state of Israel, about establishing a Jewish nation state, it actually relied on modern Western national perceptions. And it's interesting to see how the Mizrahim actually, during that time, how did they fit in this production of the modernity of the land, the modernity of the city of Jerusalem? How did they participate? Did they have any writings that actually differ or are in common with this kind of mainstream Ashkenazi writing. Later, there were more points. Yeah.
Did you want to jump in on that?
No, I want to
Okay.
ask, like, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I hear a few questions in there.
Yes. Okay.
One is a broad question about Israeli social history.
Yeah.
Outside of the musical space, in a sense, that is difficult to answer without a longer sort of dissertation on the on first of all economic relations within the burgeoning and early in the new state, particularly, one could talk about the way that to the extent that Mizrahi and local Palestinian Israeli laborers, since they were able to work, they provided they were their cheap labor. What is that TV series?
Avodah Arabit.
Yeah.
Arab labor, but
Yeah.
I mean,
It's not about Mizrahim exactly, but
right.
Yeah.
But Avodah Arabit is sort of slang for cheap labor or
Yeah.
ill-done labor as opposed to Avodah Ivrit, Hebrew labor.
yeah. Thank you.
It has other connotation
Yeah.
meanings in Arabic,
Yeah.
but we'll
Yes.
talk about it later.
Yeah.
Yes, but see, this is a critical,
Yeah.
this is one way they critically function in the early years of statehood and beyond, which and by the way, this is not a kind of a I'm not saying anything nice about that situation, let me put it that way. But what was the other part of the question was about cultural production, maybe?
Yes, about the production of this whole, call it project or canon of literature.
Yeah, well, I would argue that, one example would be someone like Buzaglo, who is throwing his own understanding of the situation into
Yeah.
the mix. I would say that in general, in terms of mainstream political discourse in song, as far as I understand, that Mizrahi musicians were not necessarily as activist in their approach to the politics because of a lot of social constraints, including who gatekept the two major recording labels,
Yeah.
Herartzi and CBS, until very late to the 60s, as well as the radio stations, of which there were few until the 1970s. That's a kind of a surface level answer. I have to think more about
yeah,
that.
yeah. Professor Sama, you wanted to add?
Unless there's someone on. Zoom.
No, there isn't. I would have.
So I just wondered if you wanted to extend your analysis and talk about the controversy that arose where instead of a war song, the protest used Haggadah, a Passover song, Chava Alberstein's taking of the classic Seder song, turning it into an anti-war song and a commentary on the Arab-Israeli dispute, and then the controversy where some argued for banning that song and everything about it. In other words, what was it that when there was a turn to a religious song, and whether you could kind of comment on that in light of your analysis?
Yeah, I would say, because I think that's a great question, because even though I didn't talk about that song, it's not really about like memorialization or commemorating anything in modern history, at least. It does, but there are other examples where something is taboo, right? And the song, actually, in this case, the songs themselves become taboo, just like Haggadah, right? So I think I would say that the very expressive power that the original song has is the very reason why the parody is so powerful, right? Because because it becomes a taboo parody and not necessarily, it's different from, for example, the example of Jerusalem of Iron versus Jerusalem of Gold, where Jerusalem that came out weeks after, the original song. Whereas today, like a sampling of that song that's reworked and manipulated the way that Bab el-Awwad was in the Habiluim parody might hit differently because the song has this semi-sacred kind of status. In this case, the song has more than a semi-sacred status. And but the thing is, instead of it becoming banned, it became the sound, part of the opening soundtrack of a prominent film starring Natalie Portman. So it's the Streisand effect, kind of, when these reactions happen, right? Because if people draw attention to it, everyone gets into it. Yeah. But yeah, it lays in the taboo, I think is the main answer to that.
Do we have any additional
We have
questions?
one short.
Oh, yeah, we give students preference. Skylar, yes.
Sorry for walking in late. I was watching from my desk. I just arrived.
Please, that's okay.
One question I had, just from an anthropological perspective, since that's my discipline background, is when you're working with works of culture as sort of your material, how do you account, and this has come up in subtle ways throughout all of these questions, but how do you account for what doesn't make it into the canon or what doesn't get produced at all because of aspects of censorship or pressure to be loyal or to be perceived as, a traitor to the nation?
You may have to repeat the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so for the people on the chat, the question was, or on the Zoom, the question was about accounting for what doesn't become canonized, right? Because canonization processes are really interesting for historians and anthropologists and their, cousins like me, who study, what gets disseminated, what has the privilege of a long genealogy like these songs. I'll leave this question of censorship aside if you don't mind, but I can answer this another way, which is, and this is good for graduate students to hear, when in peer review, early days of the manuscript years ago, of the book that addresses these questions, I got asked by both peer reviewers, why these songs, what do they really constitute a thematic repertory? And I argued, yes, actually, because of this doubling down on genealogy, because like Jerusalem's song, even though Shirei Yerushalayim is a phrase that existed before 67, and just the context for this is that there were very, very few songs during the Yeshuv and that concerned Jerusalem in a direct way, and almost none between 48 and 67 that appeared on any major record labels. Okay. Then after 67, all of a sudden, after Jerusalem of Gold, boom, it becomes a genre unto itself, stylistically diverse. And the thing that holds them together is that Jerusalem is the topic. And I argued in my book that the borrowing some music theoretical literature, that these songs are part of even though they kind of come from different sources and things, they are part of a Jerusalem song genre by virtue of participating in the genre. So it's not quite circular reasoning. I have some Foucauldian alchemy in there to make it work, but I
didn't quite follow what you're
yeah. So even though that I might have like some Shilei Eretz Yisrael, I might have a cabaret song, I might have songs you heard here, and say these are Jerusalem songs. My approach to genre theory is that they constitute a genre of Jerusalem song by virtue of the fact they participate in this discourse that's determined extra musically, or the social context makes it happen. But they're also part of other genres, right? Genre is not a container. It's more like a hashtag, right? You can have multiple hashtags on a tweet and understand that like it's coded for different kinds of categories. Its metadata is multiple. And that's my approach to looking at genres such as Shirei Yerushalayim.
We have one final question.
There is one just question here. Well, actually, it's an interesting short question. Any thoughts about Ahinoam Nini work?
Beautiful singer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually read that.
Yeah. But I just returned to the other question before we close.
Yeah.
I didn't answer the question directly, which is that because of this approach, I take a gluttonous approach to collecting songs and then assess what kinds of impacts they may have. Because the thing about a genealogical approach to history is that it's not told with a telos in mind, even though there is a risk of presentism in that. But when you put yourself on the precipice of, let's say, 1929, okay, where one of the most prominent songs I talk about happened, like songwriters and listeners and other folks involved at that period had no idea what was going to be like later, right? There are multitude of future horizons. And so trying to capture those moments from those perspectives, like with the multiple perspectives where the present isn't a given, is a challenge and also like a joy, because it allows you to, it doesn't matter that a popular song from that year is forgotten now, because then it was important, right? And so I decided what to put in based on a kind of like a my ambition, I'm not sure if it's actually realized, is to have sort of like a radical contextualization of every particular sort of text that makes it into the study.
We really don't have, can you give us 30 seconds on that?
That's a question from our audience. It was, of course, from
You want to
our
repeat
remote
what it
audience.
was?
About
but,
any thoughts about any, I know I'm Nini's. I mean, if you have any.
Oh,
if you
I
can-
thought I answered that.
Yeah, I know.
That's kind of a broad question.
That,
Yeah.
That's what I thought too, yeah.
She has a beautiful voice. I teach her work in classes where we discuss, like Israeli-Palestinian collaborations and the complexities of all this, and the way that music is used to sometimes sanitize the conflict in different ways, but also the musicians are often very sincere in their efforts. So it's a very complex topic to teach, and I think that she provides a lot of great material for that.
On the note of complexity and lots of material and a fascinating approach, let me thank Dr. Figueroa for joining us and coming in person. Let me invite everyone to join us in 2 weeks only on Zoom for a seminar from Jerusalem by Noah Heisler Rubin of the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design, entitled Digitizing Jerusalem's Archives, Urban Heritage in the Age of Digital Culture. Thanks to everyone, both on Zoom and in the room, and have a wonderful rest of the day. My name is Jonathan Sarna.